That's
Yeah,
the
that's
worst thing
what-
they could have done.
That is roast beef broth.
Oh, it does. Would you want to think from county, it's 454 grams? I mean, I don't think so.
So I guess that's all this stuff.
I only have a couple more days to get it, so.
But you guys were gone this week and here next week. Did I get anything?
Other way
Not
around. We're leaving,
only that.
we're leaving tomorrow
So
morning
when we
at 9.
shave-
25 degrees over there. What will they do? Between 22 and 25 degrees, just look at that.
Yes,
I was
it's-
confused on the first one. I thought it was missing tonight, it was on next week.
No.
Yes?
Is that the time?
Missing tonight, here next week, I'll get it.
Once we
No
start
wonder I'm
making
so
the
confused.
metric system, we might get used to it. Well, I'm not there that long,
And then leave here.
but day by day.
So they should take a chart and go.
Yeah.
It's coming out, it's going to chart out. With 0 point, the metric system uses always only 2.
Right.
Which came first, the other one or the, my sister-in-law
Well,
emailed?
I'm not
Oh,
sure.
the metric came first.
I don't think, I don't know.
Because we always think that we didn't get it first.
Yeah.
That's good.
There we go.
Well, we didn't do anything, I mean, whatever we have is
Somebody said they had
import from Europe. I mean, it's
Okay,
okay. I think it was
Mary Ann
English. But then they also had stone, and they had like different kind of, measurements, yeah.
Yeah.
Hopefully not lately.
And they're
That is
talking about
true.
stone,
Lately.
and you weigh 20 stone or whatever, you know, who the heck knows what that is.
So what there must have been, fake uniform stuff.
Like money, maybe, like stone money.
Yeah, I don't know.
I don't either. But I know the French came in with the metric system. I don't know exactly what it is.
The Bible too.
Oh, yes, oh,
That's right, came from the
Yeah,
Bible.
what's this from the, is it a cubic?
All right, we're going to go ahead and start, at least according to the clock that I'm looking at. It's 7 o'clock and time to go. Obviously, we're missing some of the people who will be on the trip with us, and I know a few of them who wouldn't be here. But we'll see if a few others join us. Well, before we go any further, let's start with a word of prayer. Father, as we gather together, we give thanks for the gift of Martin Luther, what he brought to the church, what he continues to give to us, your word and an understanding of grace that seems to somehow have become muddled over the centuries before him. We pray that as we prepare for our journey to Germany, that we will have an understanding of what he did and an understanding of what that means for us, and we'll grow in our walk with you through that, that we might be a light to the world, just as you would have us to be. In the name of your Son we pray. Amen. Good evening, welcome. And I'm not sure everyone knows each other, so rather than asking someone if you do, why don't we just take a moment, and if you would, share your name and how long you've been here at Faith, okay? And if you don't remember the exact number of years, that's okay. So, my name is Lyle Hagemeyer, and I have been here now 9+ years. So,
I'm Bert August. I've been in Faith about 12 years.
okay.
Karen Wright, and we've been here about 30 years.
Right, same 30 years. No difference, huh? Okay.
Debbie Hagemeyer, 2 months less than he has.
She stayed behind.
Stayed behind and packed more stuff. Huh?
Yeah.
Sharon Phillips, we've been at Faith about 17 years.
Dick Phillips, I got here about 10 minutes ago.
I'm Sheena McKinney, and I've been here 25 years.
Yvonne Steiner, and I've been here 20 years.
I'm Shirley Buckingham, and I've been here 9 years, the same as Lyle.
Sharon Keelak, and I've been here 38 years.
Richard Pate, 4 years. Good 4.
4, all right.
Sylvia Payne, same 4 years.
Anna Rose Eberhard, 42.
Ooh, you have.
I think you win the prize.
You win the prize.
We're sharing our name and how long you've been around here at Faith.
My name is Rich Denny. We've been in this area now 17 years.
Okay, all right. and we'll give her a moment at least to sit down. You want to share your name?
Barbara August.
And did you come originally to faith with Bert, or did you come earlier or later?
Together.
Together, okay. There are some couples who have discrepancy in their years. Debbie and me, that would be. All right, we're going to do a number of things this evening, primarily getting into the history, which we'll do again next week. We're going to be looking at the life of Martin Luther. Then will be just a little bit of time toward the end to talk about some of the practical things, see if you have any questions, and give you a little bit of an update on what I know that you may not yet be aware of. I'll be honest, this is not something I'm used to doing, so I wasn't sure how much time to give for going through Martin Luther's history. I am by no means nothing close to being a Luther scholar, all right? So when I start talking about the Bible, as I start moving through things, I find that it takes a lot, longer than what I think, in large part because I get sidetracked and I start sharing something else that I didn't originally intend to share. So what I think will take me 20 minutes ends up taking 45. Well, I won't have all those extra stories to share about Martin Luther, so what I think is going to take us an hour may take us 20 minutes. So we may go home early tonight, and if that's the case, well, then my apologies. I'll try to do better in my timing next week. So again, Martin Luther, tonight what we're going to do is look at the early years of his life. Basically, we're going to go from when he was born up to the point of just about where the Reformation began, all right? And as I say that, I should make sure we're all aware. When did the Reformation begin? What's the date that is kind of said, this is when it started?
1517.
I heard a number of them.
1517.
1517. And in fact, there would be, most of the time, be an exact date that kind of said, this is the point at which it really started. And that date would be
October 31st.
October 31st, 1517. Now, that in a large part drove when we were going on this journey, all right? Obviously, it's not 2017, but I thought about it and realized that in 2017, 1 year from when we go, it is going to be very, very crowded in that part of the world.
Yeah.
And I thought, okay, let's go a year beforehand, and then as we go through the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, we will have the memory of those places. Now, I am aware on the front side that there will be at least one thing that is not going to be up at the level that I would like it to have been, and that will be, unfortunately, Luther's house. They've taken some of the things out of that I'm not sure why, but they moved them out of that house to America for a display that's happening in the next, it's going to start in like another month, and then it will be here for a number of months, and then go back to Luther's house. So I'm not sure what we'll see there in that location, but as far as I've been, informed by Christian, everything else is pretty much ready to go, for next year. So we're going to be in good shape for that. All right. So Martin Luther again. Okay, where is Martin Luther in the estimation of the world? And as you see up here, he's rated, and this is rated number 3 according to the most influential people of the last millennium. All right, so from the year 1000 to the year 2000, who were the most influential people? And he's rated number 3 by Life, by the Arts and Entertainment Network, and by a number of books. Oh, and I was going to bring some of those in, and I forgot to do so. They did not always agree with each other. I looked at like 4 different sources. Luther was about the only one who held the same spot. Who do you think would be rated number 1 or number 2? You want to take some guesses? And there are a number of them that you can guess and be correct because there were differences on those other lists.
The Pope?
No.
No.
Napoleon.
No. Napoleon did not make number 1 or 2 on any of those lists.
Alexander the Great.
Well, I would have
He
been
was
in the
before
previous,
Well, yeah,
well,
that's
2 millennia
first, yeah.
before, actually.
Oh, yeah.
Were they good
Goes
people
way
or
back.
were they bad people?
They could be bad.
Oh,
Hitler did not make the
Oh,
list in
okay.
terms of that high.
right.
Churchill,
No,
Abraham
Henry
Lincoln,
Gates?
Mm,
Bill Gates.
no.
Last
Abe Lincoln.
100 years or 200.
Wow.
Think about printing press.
Oh,
Gutenberg.
Oh,
You know, in terms of
Well, yeah.
influencing
Oh, yeah.
the entire world and
Oh,
what came after that. Trying to remember some of the others that were on those lists. Gutenberg was one.
Gutenberg, yeah.
That's
Uh,
Gutenberg Press.
Boy, I'm gonna draw a blank now on the others, which, you know,
About like Da Vinci or?
Da Vinci was like number 5 or 6 on a couple of those. It was interesting because Darwin was like 4 or 5.
Bach,
Pythagoras?
music,
Well, and there were a number of different things in terms of why they would be on the list. Luther is rated so highly for a number of reasons, and one of which is because some of the things that he did had such vast importance on the raising of the lower classes. All right? We think of Luther for his religious, work, and certainly that's what we're, going to be considering and thinking about. But there were other things that he was very instrumental in, and that was a key piece. His bringing about the German language is why he is most noted in Germany. Before that, there was not a unified German language. And Luther's translation of the Bible into German is the standard for the German language from that point forward. Up till then, there were numerous dialects, and they had great difficulty, communicating with each other. I remember growing up when my parents both spoke German in the home, and I took a very minuscule amount of German when I was in school, and I came home and said, well, I want to have you help me with my German. My mom just said, no, I can't help you. I said, well, why not? You speak German, because she still spoke German to my grandmother, and she said, well, we didn't speak that German. We spoke, in the English, we spoke Low German.
yeah.
But the Low German wasn't always the same, which is something I found out later on. Low German that was spoken in the Northwest wasn't the same as Low German of the Northeast or the Southwest or the Center, or, all those were different dialects. And they agreed with each other on the High German, which is what Luther finally is, the one who brought into practice. All right, so we've got this man by the name of Martin Luther and all these things that he's noted for. Now, I keep moving here. I wanted to give you some information about Luther that is key for us. Again, we carry in our church his name, and yet there are many things about Luther that we might not know or might wish that wouldn't be true. Here's a quote. This is from the book called Martin Luther, the Man and His Work. It's a great volume on Martin Luther. Even those who love and respect Luther are confronted by the puzzles he poses. He was a man of intense contrast. On the one hand, he had an extremely sensitive disposition. We can recognize it in the moving words of his hymn, From Heaven Above to Earth I Come, in the charming letters to his son Hans from the Coburg Castle, or in the consoling message sent to his adversary Tetzel as he lay on his deathbed. But the same Luther could easily work himself into a rage and feel particularly productive in the process. In crudeness, his virtuosity far surpassed that of his crude contemporaries, a characteristic that can actually be repugnant to us today. His use of toilet language can be extremely tiring. And if you've ever read any of Luther's crasser works, it is very clear. He had a real toilet mouth. Luther had a childlike disposition. He could rejoice in all things, good and beautiful, in a single flower or in a blossoming cherry tree. Yet he was a typical representative of his very masculine century. By nature, he was timid, yet he stood as a champion before the emperor. He could be exceptionally charitable and understanding when dealing with questions in the realm of Christian freedom, as in his stance concerning images. On the other hand, his ability to display dogmatic intolerance and lack of appreciation for other viewpoints is offensive to us. He could, for example, flatly state that Zwingli or Erasmus was not a Christian. Personally, he was exceptionally modest and humble, refusing to let anyone use his, quote, unholy name. He didn't want to have a church named after him. He respected Melanchthon's unique gifts without envy and considered him far superior to himself. Nevertheless, he had a strong sense of self-awareness based on the conviction that he had the Lord Jesus on his side, he alone, and not his opponents. Therefore, he confidently and fearlessly called himself a prophet whom God had sent to Christendom. We can take pleasure in Luther's rich humor and detect his hidden melancholy. As a pastoral counselor, he could give his troubled brothers very practical advice. Eat, drink, joke, and flee loneliness. Yet he remained convinced that Christ was the sole consolation for the world. As the head of a household, he appeared almost middle class. He was one who longed for Judgment Day, yet he was occupied day and night with the destiny of the church. With his work of reform, he pointed to the future, yet at the same time he was deeply anchored in the past. Indeed, Luther was not a book that could be easily read. He was a human being with his contradictions. It is no wonder that he is so controversial. To see Luther from only one perspective is to do him an injustice. The concern to achieve an objective judgment must not decrease, but those who only observe Luther from a cool distance will never be able to grasp the richness of his being. No matter how we approach him, many puzzles will remain. How could it be otherwise? Life cannot be captured in stereotypes. The person of Luther belongs to history, but whoever approaches him is touched by life. And I hope that gives you just a little bit of a sense. I mean, I'm going to obviously cover very little in 2 hours of talking about Luther's life in the next couple of weeks. But even if we were to go into a semester-long class on Martin Luther, we would not have a very great understanding of who he was. And that would be true of any person, but he was a very, very complex person. At one point in his life, he wanted to reach out and reach the Jews with the news of Jesus Christ. And he was very charitable and said the Jews have been mistreated and not given a fair chance. Later in life, he made some very, very harsh statements about Jews. He, putting, I think, the best construction on it, was really talking about their spiritual life. Unfortunately, his quotes were then taken by Hitler and used to justify what Hitler was then going to do. I see that my laptop is going to lose its touch unless I do something with it once in a while. I will have to correct that for the future, so my apologies as I'll have to walk back and forth a number of times. Okay, so with that, some sources of information, particularly what I'm going to be using, this book again, which again I think is a great volume. If you're looking for something to read after the class is over, I'll certainly let you use that. Something that's a much simpler read, Martin Luther, Hero of Faith. Be very upfront. This, I think, takes a very, as much as possible, unbiased look at Martin Luther. This is pretty slanted. Okay, and you be honest in terms of what you're going to anticipate when you go. This I'm going to have with me in our trip, Traveling with Martin Luther, and this is a biographical guidebook. It has every city that was important in Martin Luther's life, and pictures of those number of the places, as well as, see if I can find one quickly, just to show you. maps of the various cities with the, spots pointed out. So I'll have this along on the trip as well. And then I borrowed from Pastor what Luther says. This is not all that Luther said. We have to recognize people from that many years ago as we look at their lives and what we know about them. Where did that information come from? Well, Luther, we probably have more than most anyone else of that time period because he was a prolific writer himself. There are, trying to recall, I think 55 volumes in Luther works. So if I wanted to get what Luther has written, it would take 55 books, every one of which is about this size or larger. And then, besides all of that, we have many of Luther's letters that he wrote to his family. He wrote many letters to his wife, and a number of letters to some of his children, and even a few of the letters to his father. And I don't know if we have any that were really written to his mother. Besides that, Luther had a large number of people who lived with him in the second half of his life. He and his wife Katie, which we'll hear about next week, had a home, and they would have quite a few people live, including some of the seminary students. These seminary students, as they came to the meal, would bring their pads of paper and would take notes on whatever Dr. Luther would say throughout the meal. Those comments are then brought together and are in a book called Luther's Table Talks. Because Luther was one who would expound on many issues continuously. And these students who took as though anything he had to say was of great value, wrote it all down. Hence some of the toilet talk. Because Luther would let him know what he thought about any subject. So right now, I'm sure if Luther were alive today, we would have numerous comments about Trump and Hillary Clinton. He would not hold back on either one. And to be honest, I would see him, and this is judgmental on my part, I would see him in personality being probably as flamboyant and unpredictable as Donald Trump. What was on his mind was going to come out of his mouth, and it didn't matter who was there or what they thought. Here it comes. So, all right, questions on anything I've covered so far? Okay.
I was gonna say too, that he had volumes of his own sermons too.
Oh, yeah.
Lots and lots of sermons.
Yeah, so as we, again, go back and look, he did commentaries on most of the books of the Bible, and I mean, just phenomenally deep thoughts for someone who, before him, had no one and did not have many of the resources that we would have today.
So, you may be getting to this. What kind of background education did he have to be so prolific and have all these opinions about everything? He must have had some amount of scholarship during his life.
And we will be there in just a few moments, so thank you, Rich. Okay. His family. Martin Luther said, my father, my grandfather, and my great-grandfather were all true peasants. He came from common stock. There was nothing unique or unusual, high class about his family. His family originally came from his grandfather, who was named, and I don't know, if you'll help me make sure I pronounce German names right, I would say that's Heine. Is that?
Heine Ludwig of Müller.
Okay.
Heine Ludwig of
Recognize that is not a misspelling on my part as I put that up there. The Luther name longer before was spelled with the D instead of our current TH. And in that section of Germany, from at least what I was reading, there are still a large number of Luthers. It was a very prominent family in terms of number of people. In terms of riches, not. Heine was a farmer, and his oldest son was named Hans. Hans has at that point changed his name. Now, do any of you know someone who's changed the spelling of their last name?
Oh, yeah.
All right. Yeah, I know it's true in Debbie's family, it's true in my family. You know, Germans particularly seem to have, have an affinity for changing the spelling of their name from time to time and keeping the last name the same, or even sometimes changing the way the name is pronounced. Anyway, Hans Luther became a miner. Now he's the oldest son. Why does he not become the farmer? Because the practice in Germany, at least at that time, was that the farm, the property, would go to the youngest son, because he would be the one most likely to have a longer life and to therefore have to not pass the property on more quickly again. So the oldest son, who would have the greatest likelihood of having a more likely to find a different job, would be put out, as would be the next number of sons, because they had larger families. The youngest son would then become the farmer. So Heine's youngest son became the farmer. Hans became a miner, and he moved to Eisleben. By the way, on the next, all the rest of the slides, if there's a town in yellow, that is one of the towns we will visit in our tours. Okay, so in Eisleben, Hans moved there. And that's in the mining, or at least at that time, the mining part of Germany. And he went there as a worker, and then a little bit later moved to Mansfeld, and did that in 1484. 1484, he was still a working person in the mine, and in 1483, in just a moment you'll see it, Martin was born. But by the time Martin went to the upper part of grade school, Hans had already risen to the point where he now was operating a number of mines and had bought himself a smelter in order to continue to move forward. So Hans was moving up into the society of that time. Now, they were never a rich family. Okay, let's not misunderstand. It wasn't like all of a sudden he's the owner of the town or the leading character. But he had moved up from being a common peasant worker to someone now who was a little bit higher. And in fact, there would be 4 men in the town who would be elected to represent the rest of the men in front of the city council. And Hans was one of those 4, and therefore had risen to prominence with the other peasants as well. All right, so, an important piece, because that becomes the means for Luther to get the education that he's going to receive, is that Hans now has a little bit of resource for him. His mother, just in case you're interested, and obviously, you recall and write down whatever you think is of value and that you want to remember. I'm just trying to give you some background information so when we get to some of these places, or as you do hear some things, that you can say, oh yeah, I know some of that. Anyway, his mother was Anna Rose?
No, Margarete Lindemann.
Okay. So, she was not from the exact same town, but was from that general area. So, went too far. Wanted to at least give you this map. This is the map out of the tour book, and it points out a number of the cities again of Martin Luther's life, and you can see them. We will not be going to one, but you can see here. Number 2 is right there, and we'll be there, and then 3 will be in as well, and that's right there. 4 will be at, so you can see, and as you look at that, you can see that most of this is, at least in my mind, kind of in central Germany. We will, in 2 weeks, really be looking at the geography of Germany, and we'll get into some of that more. But I at least want to, at least for me, as I'm hearing about cities, it's kind of helpful to have a sense, where are they, how are they in relation to each other. If you look in that lower corner down, number 9, that's where Luther will go for a trial, and we'll hear about that next week. That's Worms. And then most of the rest of the time he's in that same general vicinity, other than way down toward the southern part of Germany. 11 is Augsburg. And again, we'll hear about that next week as well. He does travel out of Germany, and we'll hear about that in just a little bit. All right, any questions? Okay. So Martin Luther's early years, again, he was born in 1483, we think. There is at least some discussion that it may not have been 1483, and Melanchthon and Luther disagreed. Now, Melanchthon was Martin Luther's probably closest friend and the one who actually ends up doing most of the significant writing of Lutheran theology that we know as the Book of Concord. They lived next to each other in Wittenberg and had a pathway between their houses in the backyards so that no one would see them going back and forth to be with each other because they had so many communications with each other. Melanchthon, from a comment from Martin's mother, said that it wasn't 1483. Martin said it was, so we're not quite certain. The interesting thing is, while we may not be certain of the year, we're exactly positive of the date. Why is that? Well, because he was born very late on November the 10th. Why does that tell us what day he was born on? Because he was baptized the very next morning on November the 11th, which just happens to be St. Martin of Tours Day. And he got his name from the saint of the day. He went to the parish, and the priest was going to baptize him, and it was St. Martin of Tours Day. He therefore became Martin Luther. Rich, you had a question? Okay. So we know he was born on November the 10th because that much we've gotten the history. That he was born late in the evening. In fact, they said it was not very long really before even midnight. The next morning, Martin was wrapped up by his father. His mother didn't go. Wrapped up by his father, took him to the parish, and he was baptized, and then he took him back home. And hence his name, Martin. He was the oldest, or maybe the second oldest. Again, it's like, okay, I tried to find more information on that, and it was like, why are they making these comments? And surely somebody has some more information somewhere, but I could not find it in my brief, run and research on Martin's life. Did he possibly, at least I think of my family, my father's family, and hey, a child who was born, didn't live very long, they kind of said, well, he wasn't, my uncle was the oldest. But there was a daughter who was born before him who just didn't live but a few days, and then therefore she was never considered the oldest. And is that the case here? Don't know. But Martin was the one that ends up being the oldest of the Lutheran children, or the Hans Luther's children. Okay, so Martin's schooling. What do we know about it? Well, we actually know quite a bit. At the age of 4½, he was enrolled at Trivial Schula in Mansfeld, all right, which was, for all intents and purposes, it's an elementary school. What would that mean in German?
Trivialschule. I think it was just a name that they gave to the town. Schule means school.
Yeah.
So trivial was probably just a name.
And
someone had started it or what.
I'm going with it in terms of the English trivia, and it's just, hey, the baseline of information that he needed.
It could be, but,
So,
What you go through in preschool perhaps, or kindergarten?
well, he was there until age 14.
Oh.
It was the school of the town, and it was a general schooling that he received. At age 14, he then, by his father's decision, was transferred to the school of Brothers of the Common Life at Magdeburg. Okay? And again, this is where his father, who's now risen in prominence and in financial means, says, I want my son to have a better education. And the local education wasn't going to get Martin where he needed to go, but understand what this means. That Martin now is separated from his mother and father and lives in a different town with someone else who, watch out for him. not at all an unusual practice, but something that certainly is unusual in American thought. And I say that, and then I remember that my father-in-law, at a certain age, had to leave the farm and went to town and would be gone from Monday to Friday and for school, and then on Friday would go back to the farm and work over the weekend, and then Sunday evening would have to go back to town. And hey, you do what you have to do, and this is where the better education was at. But for whatever reason, Hans decided that that wasn't the best school, and he, a year later, at now age 15, switched Martin to the Latin School of St. George in Eisenach. And we will be in Eisenach. It's a more important place in Luther's life because this is also where he will be hidden, and it's also where he will, no, that's it. Eisenach is where the Wartburg Castle is at, and that's where Luther will hide out, and we'll hear about that next week, and we will be there. While he's in both Magdeburg and Eisenach, he participates with a children's choir. They go around the town singing. So, let's face it, there's no TV, there's, not the entertainment sections that we have, and all of a sudden this group of children who appear outside of your home who now sing. And the expectation is, and when they sing, that you are going to pay them, but not with money, food. Remember, if at least if you ever went to a boarding school or if you went to college, what did you generally not get enough of or not like? The food that was provided for you. So these kids would walk around the town singing and then would get some food from the various people that they would sing to, And it wouldn't take very long for you to realize if you didn't give them food, they probably wouldn't come back and you'd lose your entertainment, So you better give them something and then the next time they'll be back again. So Luther does that in that time period. It's not like he was singing solo, but he was going around with the group. Music was a very big part of Martin's life as well as the culture. He also participated in the St. Anne cult. Who is St. Anne?
Mother of Jesus? Not the mother.
No, not the mother of Jesus, but Mother of Mary.
Mary.
Yeah, the Mother of Mary and Mother and Father of Mary didn't come in terms of anything about them. They're not in the Bible, but an understanding, a false gospel actually was written in around 300 or so AD. So 300 years after the fact, this gospel comes out and now starts teaching about Anne and Joachim. And Joachim and Anne rise to be saints. And St. Anne is the cult where they, particularly, she's the patron saint of minors. And the end of Eisenach, there's a very large cult of followers of St. Anne as well. Luther becomes very involved in this. It is, even before this, Luther has been struggling already with issues about, am I good enough? Luther has been taught, as have most of the children, that you have sin and you need to get rid of your sin. But he has also gotten, these teachings that, just aren't going to be very helpful, and he's struggling with what do I have to do in order to get forgiveness. Now, it's not nearly as bad as it's going to be for him down the road, but he's already got some of this going on. So, thank you, Deb. Just touch the pad, there you go. Luther is already, with the St. Anne, getting involved in a heavy dose of spirituality. And a lot of time spent in prayer, a lot of time spent in devotion, and doing penance and all that goes with that. So that's really developing at this point in Luther's life. At 18, he's graduated high school for what we would know, and he now begins his college career, and he goes to the University of Erfurt. Will be in Erfurt. This is the first official record we have of Martin Luther's life. We have the record of him becoming a student at the University of Erfurt, and it's written down, Martinus Luther ex Mansfeld. All right, so now we have someone other than, Martin or whatever, who say, hey, this is where he was at. Erfurt is actually considered one of the 3 best universities in Germany at that time. And he'll be a student there and receive his Bachelor of Arts degree at 19. I don't know how you do an entire undergraduate course of study in 1 year, but that's what occurs.
There was lots to learn in those days.
I assume so. In 1505, at age 22, Martin became a magister, which means he has a master's degree and is now supposed to begin teaching at the University of Erfurt. I skipped over the fact that at his undergraduate, he was in the middle of his class. There were, I'm trying to remember, I think 70 or 75, it's in that range of students in his class, and he was like number 30, so he was in the middle. But by the time he gets his master's degree, there are only 17 who survived, and he's now number 2. Luther is a very studious student who works very hard at his studies and is already starting to move forward in that point. So, just checking here. May the 19th, he's going to begin his studies, and he's going to study law at the University of Erfurt. Now, part of the reason for that is Erfurt University only has 3 courses of study. You're either going to study law, or medicine, or theology. Those are the only 3 courses. And Luther didn't see himself as a medical student, and theology wasn't what Dad wanted him to do. All right, there's no money to be had in church work, even then. So Luther says, Hans Luther says, you're going to be a lawyer. And Martin doesn't seem to have fought him, although I'm sure there were probably some discussions that occurred. May the 19th, he begins his law studies. July the 2nd, he had traveled home from Erfurt to Mansfeld, where the family lived, and he is now on his way back, and in a storm about 4 miles outside of Erfurt, he is caught in a very bad storm. And depending upon, who I was reading, some of them said he jumped or, threw himself to the ground. Some say the lightning hit so close that it knocked him to the ground. But no matter what, they all agree that it was in this storm that Martin says, if you save me, Saint Anne, I will become a priest, or a monk, And that's what occurs. So on July the 17th, just 2 weeks later, he joins the Augustinian order of monks in the monastery. Luther's father was livid, as you can imagine, because
Less money there.
There's no money.
there's no money to be had in the monastery, and all that I've spent getting you to this point, and now you're giving it all up, and he has nothing positive to say about it. But Luther says, hey, I've made this oath, and he and Hans did not speak for some time after that. Martin became an Augustinian novice for 1 year. Okay? He actually, before the 1 year starts, he has 2 months to come in and to, realize what it means to live in the monastery. And at the end of the 2 months is then, are you ready to now commit to this? And if you don't, fine. But if you are, then you're in. And he, after the 2 months, says yes, and he goes through the whole routine. That's where they'll shave his head except for a little patch, and he wears a cap and a white robe and then a black robe over it, and all, and it's all rough. It is a very, very difficult life in the monastery. See if I don't remember if I put it up or not. No, it would basically be get up at 3 a.m. and have your first set of prayers, and then you'd have your next set of prayers at 5, and between 3 and 5 you would work, and then you'd have early worship at 6 or 7, and then you would be working outside. Then they worshipped and had prayers 7 times through the day, and then they would retire at about 9 in the evening, having worked all day long besides the prayers, and then get up again the next morning at 3. Most of the time they only had 2 meals, if they got those, because there wasn't a lot of food generally in the monastery. It was a very difficult life. He became a priest at the designation of the Augustinian leader, who said, this is what you're going to do. He said his first Mass in May of 1507, so just 2 years after having joined the monastery.
Can you clarify the dates?
Martin
God
was,
was born in 1517. Is that not correct?
No.
the Reformation.
The Reformation. I apologize.
That's okay. I was at one point thinking I should point out to you, keep these dates in mind always in reference to where they stand from 1517, because by then, Martin will have gone through all these early things, which we talk about tonight, to get to that point. And then after 1517, the rest of his life in terms of the Lutheran Church and his family all starts to happen. Everything at this point is leading up to that. He says his first Mass in May of 1507. Now, those first 2 years in the monastery were very beneficial spiritually for Luther, because he felt peace. He finally felt like, okay, God does forgive me. But it was at his first Mass where his father came to hear him. So some, beginning to warm up to the idea. His father still wasn't happy and made a very crass comment about, yeah, I don't really believe that, the angel, spoke to you or whatever kind of thing that Luther at some point said. Luther saying the Mass, not preaching, saying the Mass, is all of a sudden confronted by what he is saying about, what's occurring, and has almost an impossible, to get through the rest of the service. Because he says, how can I be in God's presence and be doing this? And begins yet the next round of his, I don't deserve to be in God's presence. I can't be forgiven. That drives him for the next number of years. He then began studies in theology at Erfurt. Okay, his instructor says, you need to start studying theology, and he now gets that going, and will get his theology bachelor's degree. And then in the fall of 1508, John Staupitz, who is the leader of the Augustinians throughout Germany, or at least of this section, of this order of them, Staupitz tells him, I want you to go to the University of Wittenberg. Now, we many times, at least if you've ever read much about Luther, think Wittenberg University, because we've heard so much about it. That's where the Reformation will be at. That's where the 95 Theses are nailed to the door. And Wittenberg University wasn't started until 1503. All right? Well, 1503 to 1508, what are we saying? It's brand new. In fact, they have like one building, and most of the stuff is being taught in other buildings or in the monastery. Pardon me?
Online.
That's about the way it would have been, out in the hall, or down the hall, or next door in somebody's kitchen, and Luther, though, is told by Staupitz, I want you to go to Wittenberg and begin to teach philosophy there. Because he sees Luther as a very bright person who is working hard, and also recognizes that Luther will grow from this experience. Luther did not want to do the priest, and Staupitz says yes. He did not want to do this, and Staupitz said yes. And Luther, in many ways, was pushed forward by Staupitz.
He wasn't very long as a monk then, according to that.
Well, all of this was as a monk. You know, even when he's
Right,
a
but
priest,
he-
he's still a monk.
But he wasn't living there. He wasn't living in the monastery, or was
Not
he?
continuously, although even many of the monks didn't stay in the monastery, they'd still go out and work outside of the monastery. And then they'd have to be close enough to go back and forth if they didn't have something that drove them out. There was another hand.
Wittenberg was going to be Frederick the Wise's crown jewel. And Frederick the Wise had become a very prominent prince in the whole Holy Roman Empire by then. And his princedom or principality or whatever in Saxony was the only major one that did not have a notable university at that time. So that was going to be his showplace.
Yeah, exactly right. And what I haven't said anything about, and in part, you know, because we just don't have time to really go into it, is Germany in the political structure was not a nation. It was a whole series of, you know, civil states and you know, little groups, and again, they weren't united in language, nor were they united in anything else. They were electors for the Holy Roman Emperor, and Frederick, you know, each section would have one of the electors. Frederick was for this area where Wittenberg became his capital, and he's really spending a lot of money trying to build Wittenberg up as a major city in order to give himself, you know, more credibility. He's also very big into buying relics so that the relics could then, you know, enhance his position in all that he's doing. And we'll talk more about relics in just a little bit. So there's, you know, the reason Luther's going is Staupitz is, you know, pushed by Frederick to send him up there. So that's what's driving all of this. So Martin goes to Wittenberg, and while he's there, he continues his studies and his reading, and he will continue to move forward in a lot of ways. Trying to see if I put it down. All right, 1509, he received the Bachelor of Arts in the Bible degree. No, it's when he goes back to Erfurt. I got to remember, because he goes to Wittenberg, then he goes back to Erfurt, then he goes back to Wittenberg. It's when he goes back to Erfurt that he'll receive 2 more master's degrees and then also get a doctorate degree. So he had, you know, at one point, well, no, he ended up with 3 master's degrees in various fields of study and a doctor of theology degree, which is why he, you know, felt like he was okay to talk about all kinds of different subjects at that time. He also continued to seek spiritual peace with little success. It was, you know, throughout this time period where you'll hear some of the stories about Luther, who would lock himself in his room and lay on the floor and even beat himself, trying to somehow be worthy of God's forgiveness. When he was in the actual monastery in that first year, they had to break into his room one time and found him unconscious because he had mistreated himself so badly, trying to make himself worthy of God's forgiveness. That is a piece of Luther, again, that we just have to accept. You know, that's who he was. He took things very seriously on the positive side, and, you know, which drove him to distraction when later on others wouldn't take their spirituality seriously. You know, how could you not take it serious? He wasn't going to be at the same point in terms of thinking you had to earn forgiveness, but to not think it was significant just would never, you know, be something he could understand. He was then offered this position again at Erfurt. So now he goes back to the university at Erfurt and will be teaching there. While teaching at Erfurt, Martin was also continued his studies. Okay, I told you about that. Then November 1510. Now it's really critical that we keep track. Where are we in relation to 1517? 1510, Martin was asked to go to Rome to represent his monastery. Staupitz and his order of the Augustinians are in a strict line of Augustinians. There are other Augustinians, though, who are not nearly as strict in their lifestyle. And the Augustinian order has one major leader in Rome, not the Pope. I can't remember his last name. It's EPI something. Anyway, this leader of the Augustinians in Rome says, you're all going to agree, and here's the general statement of what we all will agree on. Well, it was more conservative than what the loose band of Augustinians wanted, but it was not nearly as stringent as what the tighter Augustinians wanted. And Luther was sent by Staupitz to represent the more conservative group, saying, we can't live with this looseness that you're going to now say is okay. So he goes to Rome. And in getting to Rome, never been there before, anticipates that it's going to be this great spiritual experience for him. Now, those of us who went to Israel, might say, hey, I went with some of that same kind of expectation.